All right, welcome. I see lots of familiar faces and familiar names. It is 12 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started here with our discussion group today. Welcome. On behalf of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we want to respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. I want to welcome you to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online and the August edition of the Semicolon Book Discussion Group. This month we are talking about Nikki Taylor's book, America's First Black Socialist, The Radical Life of Peter H. Clark. I'm Christina Hartlieb. I'm the executive director here at the House. Our sponsor for the Semicolon Club series is Donna's Fabulous Faux Furs. It's headquartered in Covington, Kentucky, and Donna's I can't say that right. Faux Furs designs, manufactures coats, vests, throws, and much more. You can visit their website if you want to learn more. And then please check out our website for info on our discussions, our lectures, walking tours, current exhibits, including our new outdoor exhibition called Our Neighborhood Story, a tour of this Walnut Hills block. Our discussion leader for today is Professor Rob Joyelli. Rob is an associate professor of history at the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash, where he teaches and researches on American urban and environmental history, directs the college honors program. He is also the author of Environmental Activism and the Urban Crisis, Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, published by Temple University Press in 2014, and is currently working on a project tentatively titled Race, Sprawl, and Sustainability, an Environmental History of White Flight. He's currently the chair of the board of directors of the Over-The-Rhine Museum, who is our guest today. And I will also add, he was the lead researcher and author of the 2016 Porkopolis exhibit here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and a portion of that exhibit is still on display in one of our upstairs rooms. So, Professor, take it away.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's very excited to be here today. And so excited to join you all and discuss this great book. And so honestly, I thought we would keep it relatively informal. I have a few things that I think are interesting about this that I would like to chat about. But I'm really interested in what you think, and also sort of if you have any other, the great thing about something like this is some folks obviously who have a real interest in Cincinnati history, Cincinnati's Black history, since history of race in Cincinnati, Cincinnati's 19th century history. So I'm just interested in your perspective on also questions you might have for me about sort of a broader, placing some of this work and thinking about Peter Clark in context. And so, as I was rereading the book this past couple of weeks, I'd read it when it came out. I was really struck by a number of things about this story. One is that Nikki really gives, and I call her by her first name, I should say Professor Taylor. She was a great mentor of mine. She was on my doctoral exam committee, right? And so I know her pretty well, and it was a great help for me in terms of my grounding in Black history, especially Black urban history. But one of the things I think she does so well is she gives us this great arc of 19th century history, and especially 19th century Black life. So a lot of times in American history, we have these, artificial divides, these periodizations, and the most important one arguably is the Civil War and the destruction of slavery. And that's the most important one for Black life in the United States. And then oftentimes it's in both popular discussions, but even in scholarship, it is oftentimes a before and after, even though we have, historians who acknowledge the importance and the depth of Black history and the sort of pre-Civil War period. But what Professor Taylor provides for us here is this arc of before, during, and after the Civil War, which I think is very helpful for us understanding and thinking about the continuity of Black politics specifically. The other interesting thing is really plumbing the depths of socialism and Clark's connections to socialism and to socialist activism. I will be honest, upon rereading, it's something that I wouldn't say the book lacks, but I think it could, there's room for more of a discussion and exploration of the intellectual life and the diversity of socialism within Cincinnati and in the United States and globally in the 19th century. So that could be something I think is worth exploring and is really interesting. And of course, the other part that's great about this book is she's really dealing with all the complexities of this person. I remember when she first started this project, I was a graduate student. I was talking a lot about urban history, primarily based on her first book. And if you, and you know, hopefully this group knows that the first thing you always read in any sort of historical monograph, the first thing you should always read is the acknowledgments, right? Even though hers are at the back, you always read the acknowledgments because that gives you, right, the intellectual lineage of the project and of the scholar. You can see who they thank, see where they went to grad school, right? It's usually scholars, when we read a monograph like this, read the acknowledgments and then we read the footnotes, right? Because that gives us this grounding on where to go. But if you read those acknowledgments, she talks about, you know, the lay scholar who really turned her on to this project. And I remember her talking about this. She got excited about the project because there are always these great resources, but I know she also struggled because Clark becomes this controversial figure, right? He goes from this radical life of abolitionism and socialism, but then he gets pulled into these, you know, a desire for more political power, for political patronage. And she doesn't shy away from that story at all. And it's great because it gives us this complex life instead of telling not really a celebratory biography, but by giving us, for lack of a better phrase, the warts and all. It helps place Clark in all these different aspects of 19th century history. We also see the great arc of 19th century history for the United States as well. So those are sort of three things that I thought about and I'm interested in, but I'm curious to hear what some of your thoughts are, questions you might have for me, questions you have for the larger group. And so if you could introduce yourself before you have a question, just so I can get to know each other. Do maybe you want to go around a little bit and have folks introduce themselves really quickly, if that would be okay. Is that something we can do, Christina? Great. So if someone wants to jump in and introduce themselves.
Okay, well, my name is Frederick Warren, and I am on the board of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and I chair the program committee, and that's who I am. I've lived here in Cincinnati for over 30 years, actually in Bellevue, Kentucky, and I'm retired from the printing business.
Great, thank you.
And I'm a member of the supporter of the Over-The-Rhine Museum as well.
Great, great, thank you.
My name's Amber, and I'm in Columbus, and I just, during COVID, I just started getting on Eventbrite a lot, and that's how I found out about these discussions and everything. So I've been to a few and really enjoyed them. So, and Cincinnati's a great city, so I'll say that.
Thank you, great, nice meeting you.
All right.
Hi, my name is Craig Rush. I'm a teacher at Clark Montessori, so it's kind of neat to hear about his story, and I'd like to maybe share some of what we're talking about today with my students.
Great. Just do a quick introduction.
Oh, sure. I assume we're doing introductions.
Yeah,
Christina, have you already gone? Do you want to go? No. Okay. Well, hi, I'm Amy. I learned about the Harriet Beecher Stowe House driving back and forth to work downtown every day for years. I live in Cincinnati. And a few years ago, there was a birthday party for Harriet at her house. So some friends and I came, and I've been hooked ever since. So I've been trying to come to some of as many book club discussions as possible. So it's good to see familiar faces. And I currently work as a librarian in the law library in the courthouse.
Nice meeting you.
Hi, I'm Marty Linds. I'm a volunteer at the Stowe House. started during COVID, so it's hasn't been all that long. I just have a lot of interest in history in general, and so I found this book very interesting. So I'm interested to hear what everybody has to say about it.
Great, nice meeting you.
John Seymour. I am a president of a local land trust and a long-term resident of Cincinnati and a long-term interest in Abraham Lincoln, which brought me to the Stowe House.
Great, nice meeting you. All right, does anybody want to get started? Does anybody have any sort of things they thought they were interesting, questions they have about this? We're sort of, I like to open it up at first when I do these kind of discussions, and then we can see where the conversation takes us.
I would just have to say that when I had not read the book prior to this, and I haven't read the whole thing, but anyway, but one of the first things that I often look at is just the table of contents to see where, kind of how it's structured and where it's going. And the one thing that struck me immediately that I was not aware of prior to picking it up is most of the chapters start with voice of immigration, voice of purpose, voice of equality, which really mirrors the things that we talk about here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House with our overall theme of the power of voice. So it just struck me at how congruent that structure was with what we were already doing, and how Professor Taylor was able to bring out all of those different components of voice through the writing of the whole structure.
That's a good point, Christina, because I think she really highlights that into the introduction, right? That he is a preeminent orator in the 19th century, right? And she does, and I think that's one of the real strengths of the book, is she gives so much space to his speeches and really pulling through the complexities of his talks. And I just am always baffled. I was talking about this with students, like not baffled, always fascinated by the role of oratory in 19th century America, right? I was talking about the Gettysburg Address with students, and I talk about, I wasn't even teaching this class, I was filling in for a colleague, right? And any chance I get to sort of squeeze the Gettysburg Address in there, I do. And one of the things I always give a little side note to students is I say, who was the premier speaker for the day? It wasn't Abraham Lincoln. The premier orator was somebody else, and he spoke for up to like 2.5, 3 hours. And just the importance of oration in 19th century America is really interesting. I think that's what's one of the great things about this book, is it gives us that picture. Other folks, other thoughts to get us started here?
One thing that surprised me was because I had heard prior, well, I was first introduced to Peter Clark through a paper, which was actually, I believe, a sermon that one of our fellow volunteers, Tim Krause, gave at First Unitarian on the subject of Peter Clark. And, it had highlighted the fact that he had been an associate of Frederick Douglass and had lived in his house in Rochester. And I thought that I would find out some more about that, and it was about one sentence worth of his time in Rochester, with actually no details at all. So that just surprised me, and I was curious as to why that was. And I should express my vested interest, since I'm named after Frederick Douglass.
All right, yeah, that's interesting. I looked in the footnotes, and I didn't see much other material about that as well. And I wonder if that was just partially a lack of evidence, in terms of that material, because this is, there was no papers for Peter Clark. So I wonder if that was the issue. But yeah, that's a good question too, because the book, not afraid to go and sort of explore Clark in the context of African American life. So I wonder what that choice is. You know, that's good. Yeah. Other things that surprised people by the book, or they found particular, they weren't expecting. Go ahead, Amy.
So thank you, Christina, for saying you hadn't finished, because I haven't finished either. So I'll just give that caveat, and I'm so sorry. I've been trying very. Okay, good. Phew. I hate being disruptive when I haven't finished, but I just wanted to put that out there. So something, and it's very, like, to me, it's just kind of a fun little, I smiled a little because of all the local connections, just seeing local names, like the name Disney. There's a Disney Street in Oakley near the Kroger. McMicken, of course, we know McMicken Hall. You know, the Tafts, the Hoadleys, the Grants, like to see all of the intersection with other names that we know locally was kind of a fun just nod to Cincinnati.
Anything about sort of, oh, go ahead, Amber, sorry, that's great.
Well, what I found was that, like, from the moment that I heard that this book club was even going to happen about this book, I wonder if that was like in April or May, I don't know when I found out, but I was just like, oh my God, like, just like, oh my God, I got to wait until August. Are you serious? Like, I was so excited. And then, and so my thing was, oh, I'll just read it a little bit, like, you know, before I go to bed every night, and it'll just kind of, you know, it may help me fall asleep, but it'll be interesting too, whatever. And then I find that it stresses me out. And I think what I was finding stressful was that Black people, we're still having these exact same conversations. And I just thought, and so I just was really feeling, I was just really feeling bad, like, you know, and frustrated for Peter Clark and how he's trying to convey the message, like, you know, we can't just be solely loyal to one party, like they're not, you know, because they end up taking advantage of us. Black people, we still talk about that. And so that was just, so yeah, it wasn't a gentle read. I guess I thought this was going to be a gentle read and I could read it and then like, okay, y'all go to sleep. So, so I do have a little bit more. I actually read a lot more than I thought I had, but I do have a bit more to go as well. But I find I really like it, and I think that she did a great job with it. It's awesome. So that's just me.
And to kind of piggyback a little bit on Amber, I just finished a lot of the voting rights section, and I'm sure there's more to go. And voting rights is just so preeminent right now in the conversation. I mean, it felt so contemporary, and I thought, wait, what was the date? When was this happening? Because it feels like it's now. It really does.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, like with my students, I oftentimes talk to them about the fact, and I've read the book probably 2 years ago, to be quite frank, but just how if he may have been in the South, he may have been able to advance himself politically more than he could have in the North. How in Ohio, there were almost no African-American politicians who made it, even though he had played the game fairly. He touted the Republican Party nicely. And one thing that a question that continues to reverberate in my head is nobody seems to know about Clark. But like a question is, what's his #1 legacy? And I don't know, like, he's got a prolific career, but like, what's the one thing that that you think was his greatest accomplishment?
That's a good question. I could probably chime in with mine. I'm curious what other folks think. That's a good question. What do you folks think?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but one of the things that struck me that I didn't realize before this was the connection between the German immigrants and the African American community in Cincinnati. Being of German descent, I had no knowledge of that prior to reading this. So I found that section, you know, those connections very interesting.
I would comment that perhaps his greatest achievement is one that would be hard to quantify, considering that he was, the principal of the school and an educator, and one has to assume that he, made great contributions to the minds of hundreds or thousands of people. But, that's not in the political arena, but it may well be his greatest contribution. I know that his early involvement in the convention movement was highlighted as one of his early achievements that really had a big national effect.
Yeah.
I would, at one point, one thing in the book that, as I went along, I was really appreciative of the way in which the author did not, she tried to give us a sense of what the reality was for Peter Clark at that time, not what our reality is today. But then all of a sudden, at the end of the chapter on which he had joined the Socialist Labor Party, she described him as the father of Black socialism rather than the first Black socialist. And I didn't know there was a thing of Black socialism, and I don't really think there is a thing, and I think that she went off the rails there.
So what do you mean in terms of the difference between being for Black socialism or, say, a socialist who is Black? What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't think there is a Black or a white socialism. Certainly not for Peter Clark. And I don't think there really is a 19th century socialism was not about race, and I don't think that there was a Black socialism. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I think that, to me, that is something that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more on, right? And I don't think, but that I shouldn't say that critique of the book, right? In terms of,
she does have an extensive footnote about the historians who dealt with his socialism, and particularly Philip Foner.
Yeah.
Who was a friend of my family. So
one of our preeminent labor historians. Yeah, I think I would have also liked to see a little bit more of, I should say, I'm interested in a little bit more of the sort of broader intellectual world of 19th century socialism, and then sort of plumbing, the complexities of that and how he fits in. And Marty, I think this gets to your point, right, of those connections with the Germans, and to me, what's great about this book is it helps us sort of think about the, sort of hothouse world of Cincinnati intellectual life in the 19th century, and she actually does a good job, I think, of placing us very particularly in this, this sort of very, relatively tight-knit community. People didn't, there was a lot of course, racial and class clashes in 19th century Cincinnati, but most everybody's living in the Basin area, right? So people are interacting with each other on just this crazy level that we don't think about today. As an urban historian, I'm always thinking about, how people clash together sort of face to face within communities and make social, cultural, and political alliances and conflicts. And she gives us this picture, and I think that's really interesting about these connections, literally pulling up together and forming these relationships with these German socialists. But to me, the next question would be, what is that? I want more about the world of those German socialists, right? I want more about the complexities of the different types of socialism that are brewing in the 19th century. And and she gives us a little bit of that with sort of the difference between the Marxist social and the Lassallean social democrats, right? But I would like a little bit more on that question as well, because I think that helps us expand upon just the complexity of the 19th century world.
You bring up a point that strikes me frequently, the definitions of words. change in 150 years. And when you have them applied to various portions along that 150-year timeline, they mean different things and they've got different backgrounds and they refer to different groups. It's sometimes very hard to figure out, based on what was characteristic, what would be currently the same characteristic.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's a little bit of pushing together here of concepts about socialism, and I think just more of a picture for the reader of the dynamics of 19th century politics, right? That literally industrial capitalism as we know it is coming into being, right? Especially over the course of this 19th century. You go from the 1830s, you have the emergence of merchant capitalism of the United States, but then industrial capitalism is coming into being, and people are contesting it, arguing with it, trying to wrestle with it, all at the same time. And I think that's something that's lost a little bit in this, but it's only sort of one slice of that's the thing about a biography, right? It has to follow this narrative, and oftentimes we can lose the slice of that. And especially within a place like Cincinnati, right? That was this, it's so important for this earlier stage of capitalism in America, and actually was a foundational for industrial capitalism, because this is what we did with the Porkopolis project, right? Invents mass production as we know it in the United States. And what was the contentiousness there? So that would be something that would be interesting to explore, to think about, and to think about these German socialists, what their experiences are like and how they're shaping Peter Clark. Go ahead, Amy.
And also, maybe to Craig's earlier point, there's a section in the debate about education, whether classical education or industrial education is the way to go. So it all touches on those aspects of how we prepare people to be independent and take care of their future. It's all kind of wrapped up in there in this tight little bundle.
What do you folks think about that? That debate of classical versus industrial education, right? Because she says, this is something that continues in America and Black history, especially the sort of famous conflict between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. What do you think about that? I don't know. That's an interesting point.
Yeah. What I find frustrating about that, it's like, why does it have to be either or? There isn't a way to do both, and I do, and I've started to gain a lot more respect for the Booker T. Washington, his side. I'm starting to have a lot more understanding of that as I get older than when I was younger, and he was just being seen as a pacifist and all this. But I do now, just, being an adult and, living in this system, you do have to make money, but to say well, you don't really need to learn, philosophy or this or that or mathematics or literature, whatever, why does there have to be this either or? So that's all.
And kind of like Amber was saying earlier, how contemporary the book feels, that debate is still contemporary. I went to a school classified as a classical education, and the debate of whether or not you need classics in art history in a very Western canon, Latin and all those other things, that debate was going on 30 years ago when I was in school, and it's still going on in that curriculum now. I think they still have Latin, but some of the other very European-based Western canonical traditions may have fallen from the wayside a little, which in my personal opinion, there's room for everything, kind of like Amber, why does it have to be an either or? Why can't we expand the education? Except that Craig as a teacher and Christina as a teacher and Fred as a teacher can probably say, answer that. And yes, realistically, there's only so much time, but that debate is still going on now.
I think it's interesting to compare Clark and W.E.B. Du Bois, because in many respects, they're very similar people. And I was just reading something this morning or yesterday online about Du Bois, which was underlining the fact that it wasn't until he went to Atlanta that he really experienced a society where there were a lot of African Americans. He grew up, as one of hardly any in Western Massachusetts. And although that wasn't the case for Clark, he was allowed to vote because he was, a mixed race and appeared somewhat Caucasian. And he certainly had, I think, a sense of kind of entitlement that W.E.B. Du Bois had as well. Down the road, Clark kind of went in one direction. And, I think that Nikki Taylor was very, portrayed him in a sympathetic light in the sense that he psychologically, he felt he should have power in some respect in society, should be some sort of a power possessor. He was, certainly qualified, and he had put in his dues, and it gnawed at him. His relationship, I think, to Frederick Douglass might be there, because Douglass was a person who actually achieved that, ambassadorship and that house in Washington, D.C., and that proximity to the halls of power. And so, as he got older, and as Amber said, as you get older, you don't necessarily keep the same ideas you had when you were young. And W.E.B. Du Bois, had it not been for his late in life marriage to a member of the American Communist Party, he might very well have taken the same route as Peter Clark.
Well, and one of the things that, something you said there, Fred, made me think of this. He was a teacher all of his life. He wasn't rich. So he had to make decisions for himself and his family that maybe he wouldn't have made if he didn't have to figure out how he was going to feed his family. I too haven't quite finished the book, but I just got to the section where he went to Alabama as the principal of the normal school in Huntsville, having just moved from Huntsville. That it made me my ears, I kind of perked up a little bit when I saw that. And here he was, the principal of basically an industrial school, and he was only there for a year, but from what she says about it, he was rather good at what he was doing. He didn't try to change the school. He did what he had to do to continue it as it was. And she talks about how he did it because he didn't have a job. He hadn't worked for a year when that job was offered to him, and so he had to go. He didn't have anything else to do. So as I was reading through the book, he made so many changes. He seemed like he bounced around. He tried this, he did this, he did this. He was a Republican, and then he was a socialist. He was in the liberal Republicans. He ended up a Democrat, and a couple other things in the middle there. And as I was reading it, I thought, well, can't this guy make up his mind? And even to become the Democrat when he did, when I was first reading it, I thought, well, is he just doing this to further himself, or does he really believe this? And unfortunately, I think it was a little bit of both. He had to be practical, and he did have ambitions of power that he was never able to achieve. But not being in that situation that he was in, I can't judge him for what he did. but at the same time, I kind of scratch my head a little bit and go, you know, what was he really thinking? You know, so.
Yeah, like I think in my class, the hottest debate of our African American history class is always industrial education versus Du Bois's kind of classical education. And you're right, Amber, it's not necessarily one or the other. The one thing I was wondering that a kid asked about that I don't know too much about, on his like 250 word historical marker, there is one of Clark. It says, you know, principal, educator, or, you know, teacher, principal. He almost lost his job twice. I know he lost it once, I think, for various things. But like the kid's question, and one of the things on his marker is the Black codes. Can you talk a little bit about what those look like, and how was he able to get the Democrats on board on that one? I mean, was it like something to throw like a little bone to African Americans so that, you know, maybe 10 or 15%? Like, what was the breakdown of African Americans who were Democrats when he changed, and what did changing those Black codes in effect really accomplish?
Good question. One of the things I think is good here is she does talk about the shifting of the Democratic Party with Grover Cleveland, right, in the 1880s, and how there was this move away from the staunch, you know, segregationist position, essentially, you know, pro-slavery and then segregationist, the heritage from the Civil War period sort of, and Reconstruction, sort of moving away from that. And so it gives us that complexity of Black politics and politics in general at the end of the 19th century. And so I think you're correct in that there was, in terms of, at least in Ohio, there was a certain amount of political maneuvering, right? That there's the Black constituency, which is a small but important constituency in Ohio, wants to see these codes removed. And so especially Democratic leaders within Ohio see that as a place for political gain. I think it also, from a broader political perspective, helps us understand the real, late 19th century politics is not my specialty, but it is bananas crazy, right? It is a deep hole of just confusing complexity sometimes, because on one level, a lot of people are like, you know, these Republicans and the Democrats, it's really hard to parse their differences, because on one level they can look very similar in a lot of ways. You know, it's hard to sort of, you know, when you're looking at the earlier part of the 19th century, you can, you know, clearly say this is what the Whigs stand for, this is what the Jacksonian Democrats stand for, Republican era, Civil War era Republicans, this is what they stand for. 20th century, right? Around that turn of the century, it gets confusing, but I think this helps us see it's easier to understand at a sort of local and regional level, right? That in Ohio, you have the Democrats see an opening because of what the Republican Party, how it's treating its Black constituents, right? It's taking them for granted, and Clark is part of that. Now he's also, we see his ambition seeping in, but also the reality that they see an opening for making this positive, you know, by pushing for this shift in the Black codes, can see something positive there. Is that the kind of thing your students struggle with, Craig, or the question you had, or?
Yeah, just even more generally, what exactly did the Black codes do? What did it accomplish at the end? Just even more simple level than that. Like, what was it like living in Ohio as a Black person? Cincinnati had to be the #1 city in the region, I would say, still, wouldn't you say, at that point? Like,
well, you know, it changes over the course of the 19th century. So Cincinnati is the #1 city, but then Cleveland begins to overtake it by the end of the century, right? But it was very difficult for African Americans, and especially difficult in the southern part of Ohio before the Civil War. You know, the Black codes are an excellent example, and I teach them more and more in my classes, and just the American History Survey, right? An excellent example of these complexities, and the fact that there was other, you know, there were a lot of regions in the North that didn't have slavery, but were not welcoming to African Americans, right? And it helps us understand race, because it was essentially this statement, right? Soon after Ohio becomes a state, it was this statement that white Ohioans wanted to make, that black people are not welcome here, right? That you had to have a certain amount of wealth, you had to have you had to post a bond to be able to get status. In reality, a lot of these codes were not enforced, but it put upon African Americans a type of second-class citizenship, right? They could not formally be recognized in a lot of ways. They could not get the right to vote. We have the whole sort of arc of education. But it also helps, and what I use it to do to help students also understand is the nature of, especially in the American West before the Civil War, plenty of people were anti-slavery, but they were not pro-black, right? They were anti-black in a lot of ways because they still had a racial vision for the United States, right? In a place like Ohio or Indiana or Illinois, that this was a white man's country. And they did not want slavery to end because they were fearful of black competition for land, black competition for jobs, right? And they had very racist views towards African Americans. So it helps us understand that, because that's what's also important about the Republican Party, right? In many ways, the 1850s Republican Party, when we talk about its primary slogan, right? Free soil, free labor, free men. It's keeping slavery out. They're primarily afraid of those, or primarily opposed to those slaveholders, but also it's that presence of African Americans, because they also say, all right, let's keep slavery out of the West, because slavery is probably going to die off at some point. Those African Americans are going to be free. We want to keep them in those slave regions. And that's the thing about the black codes helps us understand, especially their sort of popularity in Southern Ohio and Cincinnati, help us understand Cincinnati as this border region, right? All these groups of people, and Nikki does if you're really interested in that, of course, you got to read her first book, right? Where she talks about Black life in Cincinnati pre-Civil War, but just this entire, we have to enforce these because, and we're also anti-abolitionist, one, because of our mercantile relationships with the South, but also we are so afraid to have this sort of vision, right, that if slavery ends, there'll be this upsurge of African Americans from the South that will compete for land, labor, and jobs. Does that help a little bit, thinking about those black codes?
Yeah, so were they just politically, they couldn't vote? Was it segregation, like people couldn't go into restaurants? I mean, what exactly?
It was primarily, pardon me, it was primarily about having legal status, right? That you couldn't be a legal resident of Ohio if you were black unless you had, I think it was 2 white people vouch for you, and you posted like a $50 bond, or I forget what the number is, right? You couldn't be a legal resident. So because you could not be a legal resident, right? You couldn't vote, hold office, get all of those privileges of being a legal resident. Now, that doesn't mean that there were still not thousands of people who settled, black people who settled in Cincinnati and carved out a life for themselves, but few of them were actually able to fulfill those black codes, and because they weren't actually heavily enforced, right? They weren't heavily enforced, but they sort of hung over those black communities over the course of the 19th century. Yeah, it was that legal citizenship, and that's the other thing too, right? It's a different form of the sort of legal white supremacy than we connect with Jim Crow, right? Because that's the thing. When we talk about this history, oftentimes we want to, because we sort of because the history of white supremacy and legalized white supremacy in the United States is so long, oftentimes we want to collapse it together that it sort of all looked the same, right? But it actually, ebbs and flows with time. And there are, of course, moments of liberation. There are moments, sort of the moments in the sun, but that also the legal regimes change pretty significantly, right? And the black codes work because it helps us understand what those anxieties were at the time. It's not the Jim Crow, a lot of the Jim Crow laws, right, of sort of segregating restaurants and train cars and all sorts of stuff. Those are the anxieties of an urbanizing South in the end of the 19th century, right? That middle-class white people are afraid of rubbing shoulders with middle-class Black people, right? As you know, but then in the early part of the 19th century, the Black codes help us see a different form of anxiety. And Fred has something in the chat here to provide proof. So what do we have? The 1804 law required proof, migrate to the state, provide proof that they were free, not fugitive slaves. Anyway, hiring a Black did not have proof, would have to be fined up to $50. This law could be seen as a good faith effort to help those. In fact, this law and others followed were designed to discourage or prevent Black settlement. The 1807 law raised the fine for hiring a free Black to $100, right? This bond did not require any cash change hands, bond sureties, promised to pay the county up to $500 if free Black American ever needed public assistance or did not maintain good behavior. Really interesting when we think about our current conversations, right, about migration and movement into the United States, which is also really interesting. Does that help a little bit, Craig? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. I find it fascinating. Important. Amber, did you have something?
Yeah. Well, just going just about how Peter Clark was so, with these and, with this party, all the switching that he did. And I think that as a Black person at that time, I think one thing that is really important to remember is that some Black people were leaving the country. They had already realized, we don't have a place, it's not going to work here. And I've been listening to the 1692 Project. Y'all know what I'm talking about. I forget. Thank you. 1619. And they mentioned how Lincoln had a separate, he had a specific agency or department set up to help Black people leave. It was it's, you guys are kind of a problem here. You know what I mean? We can help y'all leave. So for it to be so clear at that time for Black people to leave, I think that it's very well understood and accepted why Peter Clark was so confused, I don't want to say confused, but why he was floating around. He didn't have a place, so he said with the Republicans, he felt like he kept getting snubbed and that they wouldn't do enough. So, okay, I'm going to try the Dems. And then, a lot of Black people have become disillusioned, and that's why a lot of them end up leaving. And I was just watching James Baldwin, the I Am Not Your Negro, and what he had said in an interview, he said, this country doesn't know what to do with Black people. White people don't know what to do with Black people in this country. If you're a slave, okay, we can deal with that. But you being free and walking around like this, this country doesn't really know what to do. And so what I see is a man here, he could have left. And she did say he didn't really seem to be too on to that idea of the whole migrating out. But it seemed that he felt okay, I'm educated. Of course, he was very smart, and he must have felt okay, I have the tools to help make some substantive change. I'm going to try to see what I can do here. And what he ended up realizing, what a lot of Black people ended up realizing, is that there's only so far white folks are going to let you go. Pretty soon, he wanted to be the minister of Haiti, even though his friend already had the job. But, and that's one thing, and they talk about how Black people, we may scramble for such few positions. And I've heard that a lot in entertainment, even, how it was only thought there could only be one Black star. And so it's with him, he wants this position. His friend already has it, but he doesn't see, it's okay, you don't want to try something else. But he didn't feel I guess he didn't feel like he could try for something else. And there was the other position, he wanted to be a treasurer or something, and he couldn't get that either. So I think it's, I think with the way, I can just be really sympathetic towards him. I think just with how things were at the time, I think that, for a man to look this off and disloyal or confused or all over the place, I get it. Because, I think James Baldwin said, this country really doesn't know what to do with Black people. So I can understand him being all confused. But one thing I have a question about is the method or the tactic of integration. How did it even come about? Like, I'm thinking worldwide, not just in Ohio, but who came up with the idea of integration? Because when it was mentioned in this book, I thought Black people were really considering integration. Like, how it seemed like with how bad things were in the 1800s, you think integration is the answer, so I found that really, I couldn't believe. And so it made me think, when did this whole idea of integration come about, where it was seen as a valid, like, this is what we need to achieve to get what we want? I'm just wondering how the whole integration concept came up, and I'm done.
I think that last question is really interesting, right? And that's one of those, I mean, if you're gonna talk about sort of the number one question in Black history in America, right? The number one debate among Black people that goes back to the 19th century. That question of integration versus separatism, right, is one of those big debates. And I'm trying to think. That's a good question, Amber. I try to think of sort of where we can, the time period wise would be 1820s, right? And that's when this debate occurs about what is the sort of place of Black people within the United States, and can we ever find a place, and is some form of nationalism, separatism, is that the solution, or, is some form of integration the solution? I'm sorry, we're gonna jump in there?
I just couldn't believe that integration was that old of a concept. I just thought that it's in the 50s and 60s or something.
I got you. Sorry. Yeah, you were. Yeah. No, I mean, it goes back to the 1820s and 30s. It goes back to that period. It really goes back to. Christina, do you have something?
Yeah, well, this whole topic debate really plays into the colonization movement and the Lane Seminary debates, and this idea that, okay, we don't want slavery around, but we don't know what to do with the people, so we're going to send them to Africa and not have to deal with the problem. And that really, that's, sometimes I oversimplify it for visitors, but that's really what the colonizationists were about, in terms of, we don't want integration, but we don't know what to do with the Black people, so we'll send them to Africa, even though by this time they wouldn't have known any African languages well, they wouldn't have known anybody in Africa, but seemed like a good idea to these white people who didn't want to have to deal with the problem, as Amber is saying.
Yeah.
So that's really kind of where this integration and segregation idea, I think, starts. And, the American Colonization Society was founded in like 1815. So through that early, the 1820s is when this debate is going. The Lane Seminary debates in 1834, where the students are talking about, okay, do we want abolition or do we want colonization? And the students all pick abolition or immediate emancipation, but they don't really, I don't think they really articulate what to do with the African Americans who would be emancipated. So it definitely is an issue and a problem starting from that point. And that really is, one of the big debates. And it's, you look at Walnut Hills in the 1950s and 60s, this microcosm of African American business and life and education. And then now it's, all of those Black, do you know how many empty lots there are over here that are, slated to become new housing projects? So it's just amazing how that has, it continues to be a source of what do we do?
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah, I think that's great, Christina, because I think that, the Lane debates and the Stowe family, and sort of grounds it there, because ultimately it helps us understand sort of two different things, right? And this gets back to what you're talking about, Amber, but it's important, I think, Nikki puts out in this book, right, the difference between emigration and colonization, right? Emigration was the desire and the belief by many Black people that we don't have a space here. We're going to choose on our own, right, to leave the United States. Maybe it's to go to Caribbean, maybe it's to go to Canada, maybe it's to go out west, maybe it's to go to places in Africa, right? That's a self choice. Colonization was a primarily white-led movement saying we don't like slavery, but we still don't want Black people in the United States, right? And that's the really interesting part about the Lane Seminary debates is they mark this turning point of those who consider themselves anti-slavery were forced to contend with, right, in many ways, Black humanity and the concept of Black citizenship, right? What are you going to do? And like you said, even the Lane rebels themselves hadn't fully conceptualized what that looks like, but ultimately it's, can we create a interracial society? Is that possible, right? And that's the radicalism of abolitionism, right? There were plenty of people, as you folks know, in 19th century America who were opposed to slavery and opposed to the expansion of slavery, but the radical abolitionists, and they weren't perfect by any means, especially the white ones, right? They weren't perfect by any means, but they were trying to a certain degree the most radical of them, right, to try to figure out what an interracial society could look like. Is that possible? You know, and some of the Black ones said, I don't think so. You know, we're going to have to forge a place somewhere else. Or is it going to be, the phrase is always a nation within a nation, right? Do we form places of autonomy and power within the United States? What does that look like? And that's a whole other interesting debate. So yeah, that's sort of, Clark helps us see this big picture question, right, from the 19th century. It was really interesting. So
Yeah, I talked to my kids too about how he was against integrated schools because of Black teachers being fired, and how right he was with that idea. And our school, ironically, now is super integrated, maybe one of the most integrated high schools in the city. At least that's what the council members say. We have city council members come. They say this is the most diverse audience we talk to all year. But it's interesting to hear the kids say their opinion, especially African-American kids, is integration really a good thing? And like one of our neighbors, we interviewed, she was teaching at a school that was integrated here, and to try to integrate the schools, they moved African-American teachers to a white school, and it didn't go very well. She wasn't welcome. The community didn't want her to move. She didn't want to move. And in the end, it was a fiasco. And in asking the kids that question, is integration a good thing? It's still an interesting question 120 years later.
Yeah. There's some good scholarship coming out now. I'll have to forward I can't remember the name of the book. I'll have to forward it to Christina. It's a relatively recent book about the sort of, and there's new scholarship coming out about this. It's sort of the tail end and the post-civil rights period in the American South, but even in the United States and generally about what, how do people make sense of a post-Jim Crow world? And the book this book is about school integration, particularly in Georgia and Atlanta. And a lot of people in the Black middle class were hesitant about a lot of these integration plans because they had a lot of good jobs, right, in these schools. And they knew if integration came down that they were going to lose their jobs. They were not going to have the status of being administrators and having a certain amount of power. And there's also, and in the last chapter here is really interesting because Professor Taylor talks about memory, right, and the construction of Taylor's memory and the story he tries to send. But when you talk to folks who have a memory of pre-civil rights schools in Black communities, and I've done this a little bit myself. I was a journalist before I was a historian, and they would just say, man, the resources we had were not as good, but the community we were able to create, and develop in these, and that's something that was lost. And I still think this is, and you get to, Craig, I still think this is something that's very important to discuss, right? That in reality, the integration, the desegregation of schools, it, obviously benefited Black school children in a lot of ways, but what was the overall result for the Black community? And that's something I think people are still debating, right? People are still debating.
And one thing I teach like 11th to 12th graders, but I teach the Urban Roots podcast, which is about Cincinnati and African Americans, is really awesome.
Yeah,
it talks about Evanston and Avondale and South Cumminsville and the detrimental effects of highways and integration. And those are some of the neighborhoods where the kids may live or they're familiar with. And many times what the kids think about, I don't know, the perception, at least of our community in large, is what the media portrays it. But then when you hear the stories of people who actually live there, it's a different story than that. And like what we've been doing over the last week is just like, what is your neighborhood like? It's called Where I'm From Poems. Like, what is it that your neighborhood actually is, and not just what someone else says it is, but what do you say?
Yeah.
Can somebody help me with this real quick? I guess we're about to go. Talking about schools, it made me think about how you were saying how Black people that made more money were leery about the integrated schools. And what I found so interesting was Taylor's take on the middlemen, the middle class, right? And like they're in the way of progress. And so please spoil the ending for me, even though I'm still reading it. But does he come around to accepting like more community type schools? Like, because he seemed to be definitely for, community owned, markets and businesses. What do you call those, co-ops or something? He was definitely for that. But I'm just wondering how his take on, education evolved, like on that. So, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because that was something I did want to discuss, where I think this could benefit with a little bit more complex exploration of socialism in the 19th century. So I put the word in the chat there. From reading through his speeches, right, and the way she describes it, his politics are very much within the vein of what's called producerism, right? And this is an important aspect of radical politics in the 19th century, end of the 19th, early part of the 20th century, which has a lot of different angles, but is all about sort of being critical of those who take advantage of sort of manipulating the market, or just owning property. These are people who do not make things with their hands or don't grow things, right? This is sort of a broad critique of the capitalist class. And that's what they say about the middlemen, right? This is the person who doesn't actually make any food, right? They don't make any things. They just take advantage of purchasing at a lower price and then selling for a higher price, and there's all different aspects of producerism. A lot of folks a lot of folks within urban contexts are going back to the late 19th, early 20th century critiques of urban landowners, right? These are people who own the real estate, but they don't actually do anything, right? They don't make anything. So we need, and a lot of people are thinking about this today with rising rents and housing prices and gentrification in a lot of urban neighborhoods in Cincinnati and around the country, right? Sort of, what are people really gaining? All they do, all they really have is the capital to be able to purchase this urban land. And I think it's interesting about Clark, right? He has this producerist critique, but we don't really see that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't, Amber, that was a good question, right? We don't really see how that particular type of critique plays into his role as an educator and education administrator. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but that's a good question.
It's worth remembering that one of his formative early experiences was with a utopian socialist community upriver from Cincinnati. And but I think that his later interaction with German socialists and Marxists affected his understanding of that prior experience.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Oh my God. Okay. Okay. I swear to God. One last thing about that though. I thought that was so cool that there were like communes at this time or something, like people who were splitting off. Oh my God. Yeah. So I really am enjoying this book, even though like it stresses me out, but I could not believe, like, I thought I can dig it. Like, like, okay, like these people are, sampling. What would it be like if we tried this and live this? I just thought that was awesome. So thank you for bringing that up. I totally forgot about that.
I think that, as we wrap up here, I think what this shows is this book could have been 1,000 pages, right? You never see these big sort of 1,000-page biographies. And what they do is that they provide this is a very tightly well-written, very enjoyable read, which is one of the things I like about it. But, she could have really plumbed all these depths in different aspects of 19th century life. Amber, yeah, that just, all the sort of intentional communities of Oneida and all these other places, right? That's a whole nother story of this response to the changes in social, political, and economic life in 19th century America. So, well, I think we're going to wrap up here. I just want to thank everybody. This was great. It went very quickly, which is always the best kind of discussion. Not like some of my discussions with my students where we sort of, I don't know if Craig ever has this experience. He seems like he's a great teacher, so he probably doesn't have these experiences where you have to draw students out, but this wasn't like that. So this was a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rob, for leading this great discussion. And there will be a recording of it that'll come out in a week or so, and we'll, if anybody wants to go back and look at anything, I will send you all links. And Rob, can I send your email to people as well?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat, and okay. Feel free to contact me. I'll give you my work email. And I will also give you the email or the web address for otrmuseum.org. Mm-hmm. So we are a new museum in Cincinnati. We just bought our building last year, and the goal of the Over-the-Rhine Museum is to tell the story of all the residents of Over-the-Rhine through its long history. We're what we call a sort of social history, community history museum. I know Fred's been a supporter, which is great. And please check out our website. We've been doing walking tours in Over-the-Rhine over the summer. And we are looking to expand into some other online events over the course of the next year. And hopefully some of you can join us and just really help support our effort. It's great to partner with the Stowe House in events like these. Our administrative director, Donna Harris, worked at the Stowe House for a good time and is a good friend and also volunteers at the Stowe House well, because we tell complementary stories about Cincinnati life, which I think is really neat, and embedded stories about the complexity of Cincinnati. They focus more on the 19th century. We focus more on the 19th and 20th century, late 19th and 20th century. So check out our website and be happy to talk more about that.
All right.
Can I say something real quick? Christina? There's a cool thing happening at the Mercantile Library, September 24th, where they're going to unveil a portrait of Peter Clark. And our students are going to be kind of introducing the artist, and also introducing in 5 to 10 minutes who Peter Clark is. So he was the first African-American member of the Mercantile Library. And this is the first portrait of an African-American in the Mercantile Library. So it's pretty cool. And it could be something you might be interested in.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'll check that out. I'm a Mercantile member. I had not seen that event, so that's a lot of fun. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, I remember seeing pictures on their website of the artist at work. And that's been going on for pre-COVID, so.
Our students were supposed to do it 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So we just found out 4 days ago they're going to redo it. So it's kind of exciting.
All right.
Great. Congrats.
All right.
Well,
Bye,
again,
everyone.
Thank you to everyone, and we'll see you next time that we have a great discussion.
Bye.